É melhor ser alegre que ser triste. Alegria é a melhor coisa que existe. É assim como a luz no coração. Mas para fazer um samba com beleza é preciso um bocado de tristeza, preciso um bocado de tristeza, senão não se faz um samba, não. Senão, é como amar uma mulher só linda. E daí? Uma mulher tem que ter qualquer coisa além da beleza, qualquer coisa de triste, qualquer coisa que chora, qualquer coisa que sente saudade. Um molejo de amor machucado, uma beleza que vem da tristeza de se saber mulher, feita apenas para amar, para sofrer pelo seu amor e para ser só perdão. Fazer samba não é contar piada. Quem faz samba assim não é de nada. O bom samba é uma forma de oração. Porque o samba é a tristeza que balança, e a tristeza tem sempre uma esperança. A tristeza tem sempre uma esperança de um dia não ser mais triste, não. Feito essa gente que anda por aí brincando com a vida. Cuidado, companheiro. A vida é para valer. E não se engane, não. Tem uma só. Pois mesmo que é bom, ninguém vai me dizer que tem sem provar, muito bem provado, com certidão passada em cartório do céu e assinado embaixo. Deus, e com firma reconhecida. A vida não é de brincadeira, amigo. A vida é a arte do encontro, embora haja tanto desencontro pela vida. Há sempre uma mulher à sua espera, com os olhos cheios de carinho e as mãos cheias de perdão. Põe um pouco de amor na sua vida,
I think
como no seu samba.
we're ready to start. Thank you so very much for leading us in with Brazilian jazz. That's the way to do it. Smooth jazz. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to pass you on to the team.
Hi, everyone. Can you see our screen okay? Amazing.
All right, I guess I can start us off with the presentation. So hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sandy, pronouns are she, her, and I'm a project coordinator with Women at the Center. I just want to welcome you all to our webinar, webinar on reclaiming touch for survivors of gender-based violence. We all deserve a relationship to touch that feels safer, empowering, and are pleasurable. This is why we decided to organize this webinar, because this topic is not only very important, but we feel that it's not talked about enough. And just as it was stated in the chat, we just want to remind everybody that the webinar is being recorded. So just to start, we're going to do a land acknowledgement. Too often, land acknowledgements are presented as something to cross off a checklist or done performatively to be politically correct. So it is important to take time to honor and recognize each of our individual relationships with the land. Otherwise, the words that we speak in a land acknowledgement hold no meaning. It is important to remember that only certain people have the right to welcome you to this land, but anyone can do a land acknowledgement. Women at the Center ask that all of you take a moment to think about your relationship with the land, whether settler or arrivant, and your responsibilities to honor the land and Indigenous people. Women at the Center acknowledges that the land that we operate on is the territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Métis, Inuit, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And this land was taken without consent. Today, this land is still home to many First Nations and Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, An inherent part of our work is taking action to disrupt and dismantle the embedded impacts of colonialism, and we stand in solidarity with Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people and call on the government and everyone living on this land to address the genocide against them by implementing the 231 imperative changes from the National Inquiry into missing and Indigenous women and girls, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Sorry about that. We also want to offer a trigger activation warning as this presentation involves discussions around gender-based violence. Please only listen if you're able to do so. Also, feel free to step away or take a deep breath during the webinar as needed. If you need any support while you're listening, please reach out to your local networks, and you can also connect with iDetermine.ca for support, and we'll put some links in the chat shortly. And we also want to mention that we do have some peer support available. So we understand that the content of this presentation might be triggering. So if at any point you need any support, we have a person available here. So please contact Samaya, who is on the call, and her Zoom name has peer support within it. We will provide you with the private Zoom link. So please do that if you need to. And that being said, I will pass it over to Kelsey.
Thank you so much, Sandy. Hi, everyone. I'm Kelsey. I work at Women at the Center with Sandy. I want to briefly speak to a few points that we hope everyone is mindful of today and beyond. The first is about language. We recognize language as a really, really powerful tool that can empower us as much as it can oppress and cause harm. So I ask that we're all very critical and mindful of the words that we use in this space and that we reflect upon their history and impact, finding accountability in our language and choices. With that, we hope that this is a respectful and compassionate space. And so please, we hope that everyone's kind to each other and that we hold each other in compassion. And part of this involves being engaged in the moment. So this can look like active listening, sharing thoughtfully and openly, self-reflection on our identities or otherwise. But we equally invite you to take breaks or step away from the screen if you need to do so in order to be present. And then this next point is very important to us. We believe survivors of gender-based violence in this space and beyond. Survivors are the true experts of their experiences, but also the paths towards sustainable, long-term, and transformative solutions for healing, advocacy, and safety. Disbelief and quieting of truths and invalidation are products of white male supremacy, and that's something that we're working to counter today with this call. And then finally, we ask that everyone's very kind to yourself. Today may involve some very difficult or complex conversations. So be kind with yourself wherever you are on this journey as a survivor towards healing and advocacy and change, or as an accomplice standing in solidarity with survivors of gender-based violence. We also want to thank you all for taking the time to be here to help create this space today with us. As a bit of background, this webinar was organized by Women at the Center. We are a survivor-centered and led nonprofit working to eradicate all forms of gender-based violence against women, girls, Two-Spirit, trans, and gender diverse folks in Canada, but also on a global scale. Survivors are very much at the core of the work that we do, as we recognize that their lived experience is the leading expertise to guide, develop, and implement this work to eradicate GBV. We have over 6,000 members right now across the world who all identify as survivors engaged in this personal, political, and social advocacy, research, education, and knowledge mobilization that's very necessary to generate the valuable change in our communities that we are hoping to see. We want to offer a brief overview of today. We've completed our welcomes, and we are now going to move on to our roundtable, first introducing our amazing facilitator, followed by our wonderful panelists, all bringing in a very wide range of expertise and experience to the conversation on reclaiming touch today. And this will be followed by a brief question and answer period. So throughout the call today, we invite you all to use the Q&A function on the webinar setting to share questions, and we'll hopefully get to answer a few of these questions towards the end of the call. All right, so let's meet our panelists and facilitators. So Nneka McGregor is our amazing co-founder and executive director here at Women at the Center. Speaking from personal experience, she's very much the glue that holds all of this work together and also makes it all possible. And she can only be described as wonderful, powerful, compassionate, and deeply, deeply kind. So we're incredibly lucky to have Nneka as our facilitator today. So Nneka, I'm going to invite you to introduce yourself now just a bit more, because I know there's a lot that you do, and I definitely encompass it all.
Thank you so very much for that beautiful, beautiful intro. I want to actually start by acknowledging you, Kelsey, and Sandy for coordinating this wonderful, wonderful webinar. This, what I know is going to be a phenomenal conversation with these brilliant, brilliant panelists. As Kelsey said, my name is Nneka, and I am the co-founder of this not so small but extremely mighty organization. And I do a lot of stuff, a lot of things, but really come at all of this work from a place of an unapologetic survivor who is committed to making sure that the world that I leave for my children and my grandson, okay, is different from the world that I experienced growing up. You will see all the stuff that I do. If you want to read more, go find me on LinkedIn, but I won't take up any more time sort of talking about that stuff, because I think the conversation is much, much, much more interesting. So back to you, Kelsey.
Thank you, Nneka. All right, so our first panelist is Samantha Biddy. And Samantha, I'd like to invite you to introduce yourself a bit more.
Hi, everyone. So I am Samantha Biddy. My pronouns are she, her. Similar to what Nneka said, there's like, some words here about who I am and what I do. But more than anything, I identify as a survivor. I am a sober person in long-term recovery from alcoholism and drug addiction. I am the words are there. I'm a leading sexy clown in sexual health and consent work. And yeah, I'm just excited to get into this conversation. I honestly, Google me if that's cool, but I'm excited to hear from everybody, and that's my cat Lolly.
Amazing. Thank you, Samantha. That was a perfect introduction. All right, our next panelist is the amazing Marley Liss. So Marley, I'll pass it to you.
Hello, everyone. I love those intros so much. I was smiling over here. My name is Marley. My pronouns are she, her. Lots of words here as well. But ones that feel quite important to me are, claiming identity as femme, lover of pink, Sagittarius, lesbian, Jewish, feminist, also a survivor, and really coming from that lens today. And I'm so grateful for the work Women at the Center does to really validate, legitimize, uplift, celebrate survivors' voices. So I'm really honored to be a part of that. And I know there's so many of us sharing that solidarity today. So thank you so much for having me. I'll leave it at that. You can Google me as well if you'd like.
Amazing. Thanks, Marley. I think we're still having some tech issues getting Dr. JJ Wright on the call. Oh, they're just popping in right now. Hi, Dr. JJ Wright. So sorry for the tech issues. Really appreciate that we got you on here just in time. Are you comfortable doing an introduction right now, or do you want us to cycle back really quick to you?
Maybe cycle back because
Sounds good.
15 minutes of tech issues. So
no problem. So Layla, Layla, we're going to pass it off to you to do an introduction.
Hey, hi, I'm Layla. She, her, they, them. I am a survivor who turned my survivor story into a thriver, and that's why we're here today. I have been in the world of exotic dance, sexual education, anti-diet culture education. My creative hat is always on. I still dance, and and then I'm also a counselor. So community is my jam. I'm a sex positive feminist, and I am just filled with all the heart smiles and butterflies and joy to be here with all of you today.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Layla. And Dr. JJ Wright, again, so sorry for the tech issues, classic Zoom, but we're so grateful that you're on the call today. So I'll pass it to you to do an introduction.
Hi, how to introduce myself. This is always such a funny thing. I'm so grateful to be here with you all today, though. I'm calling in from Edmonton on Treaty 6 territory. And my name is Dr. JJ Wright. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm an assistant prof of sociology and gender studies at MacEwan U. I mostly study issues around sexual health, GBV prevention, education, but most recently really focusing on 2S LGBTQIA+ communities and young adults specifically. And I'm, a community-based researcher, and I will sort of leave my introduction of how I sort of came to the work when we get to that piece. But yeah, I live in Edmonton with my 2 cats, Luna and Midnight, who I adore. And I just really want my work to help foster more community care, because I know I've certainly needed it in the past as a survivor, and I would like to see some shifts. And I'm just so grateful to be here with folks who are making some of those shifts that I love to see in the world. So yeah, hi everyone.
All right, thank you so much, JJ. Great introductions, everyone. Really glad we're all here together. And I'm going to stop sharing screen now so we can get the conversation going and pass it over to Nneka.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Dr. JJ, do I have to call you Dr. JJ? I know, I really should, because I do this with my colleague, all my colleagues that have PhDs. I know my dad would have insisted that, you call them by the name because they've done all that work. So I feel conflicted with calling you Dr. JJ because it's so formal and so removed. So I'm going to take your lead. What do I do?
I appreciate that. Yeah, no, I mean, in formal introductions, I use my doctor name because, I'm a first generation scholar. I'm very proud of all those years that I suffered through grad school to get this doctorate. But no, I'm just a person. I'm just JJ. So
well, we're family here. So it's never just JJ. We're family here. So we'll call you JJ. So I want to start by asking each of you to sort of lean into the space and share with all of us how you came into this work of touch and reclaiming touch and gender-based violence. I'm going to start with Samantha.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I look forward to saying all the things that everyone else was planning to say and putting them all on the spot.
Good girl.
About what brings them to this work. I mean, like I said, I think that if we're all here, we're all survivors. Being a survivor looks different for different people, different types of survivorship. I think the thing that I've been thinking about the most is what keeps me here, what keeps me in the work and how it keeps me. And so as someone who experienced sexual violence as a child and then throughout adulthood, what drew me to sexual health specifically when I got into it was just the lack of consent that I experienced, the lack of informed education in accessing sexual health care and abortion care and reproductive care. And I found, I want to be the person on the other side of this experience. And that was me at 17. Also just like an Aries. So I was like a horny child. I was like, oh, like I love sex. So I'm really interested in this. And, believe it or not, 37 now, genetics, Botox, whatever. I've been in sexual health and consent work and anti-oppression work and liberation work for about 20 years. And why I started is why I'm still here today, and why I'm still here today changes all the time. So that's what I would say about that.
Okay, well, that's a mic drop. So to the other three, good luck. Right? Good luck leaning into that. Well, I'm going to, invite JJ. What are your thoughts?
okay, I'll take the challenge. Yeah, that was an amazing thoughts around why any of us come to the work. I think it's probably to help younger versions of ourselves, and we know there's other people out there experiencing the same thing. in maybe, you know, different ways, but still. I'm coming to the work as a survivor of complex trauma. I had a double loss when I was 15. My mom and sister were killed in a car accident. And my dad sort of lost his mind, let's say, after that, and I became houseless. I had a very stable upbringing, close with my mom and sister, but things totally shifted after. And there I became a complex trauma survivor because my dad became abusive. I'm houseless then, and I'm coping in all sorts of different ways. And so, you know, 180 life change at 15. And as with so many complex trauma survivors, I experienced sexual re-victimization. And I experienced all the things that I went on to study in school. So I made it to, I'm a high school dropout, but I made it to university. And I discovered women and gender studies and the language that spoke to me so deeply. And I kept pursuing this question of sexual agency because, like, you know, having sex to cope with trauma, I thought, why isn't this making me feel better, right? And I'm supposed to be this liberated young woman, you know, living that girls run the world, you know, Cosmo life. Just, you know, I think when I was growing up anyway, we had this whole, you know, go to Cosmo to find out how to give the best blowjob or something like that. That was the era I'm coming from. And it was very much like, if you act like a man, then you're going to feel empowered. So I didn't when I did that. And I just was re-victimized. And so when in 2015, I'm doing my PhD, still pursuing questions about sexual agency, and the new curriculum came out in Ontario for sex ed, and consent was added. And some people were up in arms, some people were happy. I read it, and as a trauma survivor, I was like, there's no way this would speak to me. I guess just telling people to say yes or no, I'm not in this document, and I know there's a ton of kids that aren't as well. So that's what my thesis was on, looking at dissociation, acquiescence, substance use, hypersexuality, ways we cope with trauma, but then can cause more trauma. So that tension between things that are actually like good for us and make us feel stronger and help us get through things, and then self-destructiveness. And what do we do with all these pieces to support survivors and also like teach people around them to support them too? And that's how I'm coming into the work. And I do that as a community-based researcher. The last thing I'll just say, I wanted to plug CCAN today, the Sex Education or Information Education Council of Canada. I had the privilege of working with them to create national guidelines for integrating GBV prevention into comprehensive sex ed in schools. And they released an amazing, enormous document today. So I just wanted to shout out to CCAN also for the incredible work that they're doing. And thank you for letting me have that very long introduction to how I got to
We love the introduction. Another mic drop, which just gives you an indication of how amazing this panel is completely. And as far as the plug for CCAN, put it in the chat, you know, send it. We will share it with everybody, because anybody that's doing amazing work in this area needs to be amplified. So chef's kiss, beautiful. Marley, what brings you?
So much. Wow, I've already had so many goosebumps. I was like, I'm either really cold or I'm having a lot of goosebumps, but it's definitely the latter. And I appreciate you all so much. What brings me to this specific work? So I was studying social work. Like, I started studying social work after high school, and I was really passionate about gender-based violence work already, just for a lot of different reasons. Having experiences within rape culture, having so many people go through different things. But then I experienced a rape while I was studying social work. And I started to feel the disconnect between everything I was learning about on a conceptual level versus what was actually happening in my body. So on a conceptual level, I was like a feminist. I was like, self-blame is the worst. It's never the victim's fault, all these things. But in my body, I didn't feel that. I was holding self-blame like in my cells. I felt that in my posture. I felt it in my breath. I felt it in my own relationship to sexuality. And I really shut down completely at that time in terms of sexuality and pleasure. I definitely experienced hyposexuality. And then I was also questioning my sexual orientation for the first time. And that was just so confusing to navigate alongside surviving trauma, and getting help, receiving support for that eventually led me to somatic sex education, which I'm so, so grateful for, because it really builds those bridges. It looks at like all these different systems like ableism and fat phobia and racism and compulsory heterosexuality, and then looks at how is that living in our bodies. And so that for me is when I really started to feel a sense of healing, of reclamation. I was able to like really claim lesbian pride. I was able to develop a relationship to sexuality that felt safe for me, rather than just following the scripts I've been given or trying to be progressive by opposing all the scripts I've been given. Because I think I got caught in that for a while too. I was like, well, I'm just going to defy everything and do the opposite. But then that wasn't necessarily authentic either. So the somatic work just made me so passionate. And I started working with many different survivors and speaking to survivors all over the world, and just supporting folks in turning safely back towards their bodies and reclaiming pleasure in a way that truly feels accessible and really disrupts this like one size fits all approach to pleasure and sexuality. So that's a minier version of what brought me here.
I love that minier version. And I've heard the sort of the slightly extended, but it's never enough, because I love the way you, not only you conceptualize it, but you graphically describe it, right? The processes that you went through. So another chef's kiss of an introduction, loving all of this. And Layla, lean in. Why? How did you come into this?
I'm in Vancouver, and I'm experiencing a very Vancouver experience where there is a massive construction sound happening right outside, booming into.
No one can hear it.
The living room. Okay, perfect. Okay, great. Like, oh, this is a Vancouver moment for sure.
Nope.
Yeah. So what brings me to this work? So I, as I said earlier, I am a survivor. I have a history of sexual assault, sexual harassment, and that led me into this state of kind of this relationship between victim blaming, as well as then like, defying victim blaming, and then just getting to a point where I was just so tired of feeling like a victim and angry, all the emotions of grief, also high Aries energy, very sexual, very sex positive, love sex, couldn't live without it. And was like, okay, damn, we're caught in this trap between like being infuriated by what has happened, what continues to happen, what I see happen, and then also really wanting it to continue, really wanting to continue my like sexuality and explore my sexuality safely. And so that like dissonance that was created just kind of lit this spark and this fire inside me that was like, I want to be a part of the change. I want to understand this. I want to understand how to educate around this. I want to understand how to advocate. And so I've been an exotic dancer. I did burlesque for years. And now I still do go-go dancing, as well as all kinds of theatrical dancing. I dance worldwide at this point, which is really exciting. And yeah, I'm also a counselor. I have my notes down here just because when I get excited, I forget things. So if you see me peer down, that's why. I'm a counselor. I love working with women and women empowerment. And anti-diet culture education is something I'm also very passionate about, as well as the low desire for women partnered with men and how that transpires. It's the I'm going to shout out to Lori Brotto. If you don't know who they are, I recommend you go and look at their research. They're incredible. And they really helped me open my eyes to this idea as to how the patriarchy shows up in our relationships and our relationship with desire, and how that how gender-based violence really shows up in especially the women's relationship with sexual desire. And so I've done a lot of research across the world of sociology and psychology. And yeah, we'll leave it at that. I'm just so incredibly honored to be here.
I love all of that. I love all of that from all of you. And one of the sort of the follow through thread is that we all came into this work because of our lived experience as survivors. And one of the things that really resonated with me was how the fact of the trauma and the violence didn't silence, right? It actually ignited and sort of made us into these revolutionaries. So I really want to honor that in each of you and to say how incredibly proud I am to be in this space with all of you. I'm going to go back to you, Layla, to ask you, why is it important, do you think, that we have this type of conversation? Why is this conversation important?
Well, I think that we all have value to add, as well as I know for myself, when I was in the throes of victim blaming within myself and internalized victimization, it took me listening to other people to understand where my thoughts were maybe unbeneficial, or where the conditioning of this, like the social rhetoric that exists, like rape culture, was leading me to believe that I was to blame in some way and I was at fault. And it took me leaning into a community of educators. And I'm so blessed to be as curious as I am, versus like, I could have shut down, but I didn't. I was curious and I reached out and I listened. I listened to panelists like this. I stepped into education rooms, kind of like JJ was saying as well. Like I just got super curious. And I feel like, sorry, Vancouver is happening here. We've got honking, we've got sirens. But I just feel as though it's the community and really seeing that you're not alone that allows people to find the path to healing, because it can be so incredibly isolating when you have this trauma and you're holding it in and you're self-blaming, versus realizing like there's so much more to the story and your healing is nuanced, and that every survivor, I genuinely believe every single survivor has something to offer another survivor. And when we get to see each other, not as victims, but as humans who have had this very challenging, barrier-driven experience, and we get to see each other at all of our different paths and all of the different cycles of healing, to know that like there's a compassion for one another in that, and that you get to be seen, and that isn't a burden to everybody, but also can be connecting. And then also to see that healing is absolutely possible. And in fact, I dare to say, for those of us on this here, and hopefully many of you out there, that it's not only possible, but it can add so much purpose and bring so much value to your life. And you can create like existential value out of what happened. And so I think seeing that is incredibly important, especially when you are in the throes of like the lows.
Wow. I've got nothing. That was, I mean, so spot on, especially around the importance of community and seeing yourself in others, and then using that trauma as a way to motivate and inspire. I love everything you said. JJ, what are your thoughts?
So that was so beautiful. And Leila, you really have this way of speaking where I was just like getting emotionally getting closer. I was like, keep talking. It's so soothing to hear about your experience and your thoughts that you just shared. So thank you. Wow. Yeah, this is an interesting panel, because I feel like there's healing work actually happening as we're talking, and my heart is, it just feels like it's glowing or something. So anyways, yeah, this conversation I think is important in terms of how I'm thinking about it, because survivors deserve to be embodied, right? And so there's just not the structures in society that are in place that allow survivors to get embodied after trauma. And as was already pointed to, so much therapy isn't somatically focused. So much sex ed is, only until recently started to become more somatically focused, including with folks who are in this room who are spearheading that. And And so I think it's important to have these public conversations about disembodiment and how we reconnect to ourselves to make this knowledgeable more accessible. But in terms of my research and my lived experience, I also think about how survivors who are disconnected from themselves are re-victimized, and re-victimized at a lot higher rates. So in Canada, folks who are survivors of trauma are re-victimized at 3 times the rate of folks who aren't survivors. And in my research, I see people who are dissociated in particular, who face some of the most complicated and frankly soul-crushing experiences of like gray area experiences of consent too, where there's a ton of victim blaming, and it's outside of the law and the black and white focus that it has. So I think we have to think about how to create a society where survivors who are most disconnected from themselves can be supported by sexual partners and not re-victimized. And I think we have to create sexual cultures where women and femmes in particular are empowered to understand their desires and be embodied when they're connected to those desires. And so, yeah, for me, that's what I think about when I think about how the work is important.
To me, one of the things you just touched on around having the capacity to go back into our bodies in order to not perpetuate the violence that the system has already sort of wrought on us is one of the reasons, and this is not a plug for the organization, but that's one of the reasons why Women at the Centre exists, is about creating that space where we inhabit our bodies and we inhabit the world and do it in an unapologetic way, right? Because we understand that we have equal and equitable rights to do so. So, and I'm really curious about your research, your dissertation. So again, you have to share it, put it in the post, in the link somewhere, and we will figure out a way to disseminate it even wider than it already is, because it sounds absolutely like a must read. It should be on everybody's Christmas or end of year gift list. Yes.
Maybe
It
not.
should be on Amazon. It should be on Amazon. Let's
Okay,
get it on
yeah,
Amazon.
maybe not around the happiest time of the year. It's
well, you never know. You never know. Sam. So
sure.
why is this conversation important to have?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that keeps coming up for me is the necessity to create entry points into the conversation, and the way that, sometimes it can feel so siloed, right? Especially within, academia, and what can happen with like the pathologizing of behaviors, and who has a seat at the table, whose voices are coming out of podiums. As someone who is as someone who's interracial, ancestry in the Caribbean, grew up with those, like a lot of those narratives. Certain things, certain behaviors were very normalized, certain value systems very normalized. And we often don't question truths, even when they don't feel authentic to us, And I think that like my experience of like wanting to talk about these things publicly, because I always did clinic work. I was always like kind of one-to-one in the background. And I was like identifying all these patterns where I was like, there are certain people who are not being represented in the kind of whatever limited mainstream narratives we have about survivors, right? Whether that was their age, their gender, their racialization, all those things. And, I do a lot of work, especially with young Black girls and newcomers and Muslim women and things like that, where it's just like, we need to take up space in these spaces. And sometimes, a lot of times, we have to create those spaces in order to take up those spaces. And I think it's important to have these conversations because, like, not to be trite, but if you can't see it, you can't be it. And I was very fearful of like putting myself into the world to talk about these things, even in safer spaces, right? And it's part of the reason why Samantha Biddy as a character exists, to do that work for me. so that I can also keep my stuff out of it in a way that is still helpful and beneficial to people. But, you know, I just think that the more times we have this conversation, the more times we bring our lived experience into it. As I think it was Layla, you were saying about how every survivor has something to add to this conversation. It's really important that we look at who's seeing themselves in the conversation, and then making more and more and more space for that to be a normal thing, so that, you know, when you talk about re-victimization, JJ, it's like, well, where are the partners, and like, how do we build capacity in people, and the different ways that we can create entry points into that capacity building. Because if it's just happening in classrooms or it's just happening in centers, it's like, that's not necessarily accessible to all of us. And so I just think the more times we can have this conversation in a dynamic way, the more people can see themselves in the experiences. And something that last thing I'll say is that something I learned in my journey of recovery from alcoholism is that, you know, these experiences that I've had that have made me so unwell, then translate into helping another person, and it gives it a meaning that I never had access to. And so I see it as a responsibility and an obligation to share it in a way that is, you know, as Layla said, community driven. So
I love you. I love everybody here, but you said a couple of things that made me catch my breath. So the fact that you are doing work with young Black girls in a world where young Black girls are hypersexualized, there's the adultification of young Black girls, and having somebody like you to be there to speak truth to them about their lived experience. And as you said, being able to see you and to hear you and to relate to you, I think is a work of the goddesses, let's put it this way. And I'm really profoundly grateful that you are in that space doing that work. So really appreciate that contribution. Marley.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. Also, JJ, we've been connected online for so long, so I'm very happy to meet in this way. And I loved that you said your heart feels like it's glowing here, because I feel that as well. And I feel like everyone watching is probably, hopefully, feeling that as well. Yeah, so why is this work important? Such a huge, huge, huge question. So I think we're here and we're talking about reclaiming, relearning touch after trauma. And the word touch can maybe be grouped with different associations like pleasure and sexuality and desire and a whole lot of things that might feel complicated. And I think we're doing something very radical here, because trauma is a very taboo topic. It's not something that we necessarily feel comfy bringing up at the dinner table to our friends. It's very stigmatized, it's very silenced. And then touch, sexuality, pleasure, all those words we might group together are also made very taboo, stigmatized, deemed inappropriate. So there's just so much silence and therefore shame coding both of these topics. And so I think this intersection is such an important one. And I'm so happy that this event exists today, because I remember looking for it. Like, I remember looking for this exact event and not finding it. So I think when we don't find it, we end up turning back towards mainstream sources. And the mainstream sex ed we have today is not so great. It's lacking. Like you said, JJ, you looked at that curriculum for consent and you said, this wouldn't do it for me. This wouldn't work for me. It's not trauma informed. It's ableist. It's one size fits all. It's fat phobic. It's racist. It's cis heteronormative. It's safe sex equals pregnancy prevention, assuming it's always penis and vagina penetration, all these things. So there's just such a lack in terms of mainstream sex education that can lead people more ashamed, more isolated, feel more lost. So creating spaces like this where we're both saying, let's fight for transformation within the mainstream, but let's also create alternative spaces where we're amplifying voices that don't fit that little box that's been deemed appropriate academic sex ed. By hearing from everyone here today is so important, and just creating space for people to safely sit with this topic after maybe a lifetime of feeling like they have to shove it down or not think about it or dismiss what feels authentic to them. So it feels immensely important, and I'm very stoked that this event exists. So thank you again to Sandy and NECA and Kelsey and Women at the Center and Samantha and JJ and Layla for being here and speaking on this.
I really appreciate that. And I just want to go back to the, JJ, when you talked about the sex ed, when it came out in Ontario, and it was Kathleen Wynne's government. And I remember when it came out, how there was a faction that thought it was so revolutionary, right? It was such a big deal. And I remember, again, my team sort of looking at it and thinking, this is so even less than basic. If this is the standard that you think this is the bar, then we have a long way to go, a long way to go. And so what I'm hoping we're doing today is sort of planting seeds on how do we revolutionize this issue, right? How do we bring it out into the world and do it differently and do it better? And Marley, because you started talking about the understanding what the difference is between touch and desire, I want to ask you to begin this conversation about what do you think is the relationship between touch and desire, and how do we help especially young girls growing up in the world today? How do we help them come to a really, really personal understanding of that?
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, I think our understanding of the word desire is really complicated. And I really emphasize the somatic work, the embodied piece around relearning and reclaiming what desire is through a felt experience. So what feels very important to say is like, desire can certainly exist without touch, and that's great. But touch should not exist without desire, because that's non-consent. So those things like have to go together. Desire must be present for touch to be present. But for a lot of us, we might not even recognize our own experience of desire. We might really struggle to communicate it. We might feel unsafe to communicate it. And reclaiming our ability to notice, trust, value, communicate our wants and our boundaries is such a huge part of this work. And we all come into the world with the capacity to recognize our yes and our no. If you look at like a little baby, they're very clear about their yes and their no, right? They don't want any more food. They're like, push it away, throw it. They're not shy about their no. And when they want more food, they're crying, they're reaching for it. They're not shy about their yes. But throughout our lives, because of conditioning, rape culture, people-pleasing notions of deserving that come with different intersectional identities, with marginalized groups especially, and with personal and systemic trauma, it can become really our capacity to recognize and validate and speak our yes and our no can start to feel really out of reach. So starting to reclaim the capacity to just notice what's happening in our bodies, doing that really deep embodied work to recognize desire through dialoguing with our bodies, through asking ourselves, practicing self-consent. Even if you're like ordering food at a restaurant, instead of going by social cues and scripts of what's expected, turning inward and being like, what does my body actually really want right now? What would feel really good in my belly? And choosing that way is such a beautiful, simple way to start turning back inward, reclaiming desire and letting that fuel your choices and communication. So it's like really, really, really big and complex work. But if you're struggling to notice or communicate your desires, boundaries, it's not because you're lacking or because like you're broken or something like that. It's because of all those systems and the compounding trauma and depression and all of that that leads us to feel really far away from that skill. So that was a bit of a tangent, but
not at all. It was spot on. It was absolutely, absolutely spot on. And I really appreciate the way you sort of laid out the difference. So I'm curious, and this is to the other three panelists, same question, but if you could define, I know this is unscripted now, we're really going off the script, but if you can define sort of your understanding, this is coming from Marley, your understanding of your definition of desire and your definition of touch, as you then tell us what the difference is. I am going to lean into Samantha.
That was a really hard question. The first thing I want to say is that I heavily identify as a baby, Marley. A lot of my learning to practice non-judgment of myself, a lot of my somatic practice is about that baby in me that is like, of course I do, like that sort of feeling of course I do, whatever it is that leads to the want or not want, and so yeah, big baby energy over here. And I also, whenever I see like a baby crying or anything, I'm like, yeah, I know. And you don't even know, but you know. You know what I mean? Like, so desire and touch. Wow. I mean, even to Marley's point about like extracting desire from even sexual, right? I think we hear words like desire, pleasure, and immediately we assign sexuality to it. And I think that with that comes all of those loaded pieces: shame, judgment, guilt, all the kind of, where is it? I don't know. I have like the emotions, the like tertiary, secondary, primary, like where do they all come back to? They come back to fear, they come back to sadness, anger, maybe. And I think for me, the question was, how do I define desire? Desire is the question of, what am I seeking? What am I seeking? And it was interesting, you brought up that thing about touch can't exist without desire, because that is like in conflict with consent. You articulated it better than that, but it makes me really think about all the times, and to like, what JJ was saying about re-victimize, like all the times when we access touch that doesn't necessarily align with a desire, but there's some desire, like there's like, what am I seeking? Like if we're talking about like the agency and when we make the choices that are clouded by all sorts of things, it's like, what am I seeking? Why is touch the tool for that? The same thing can be said about substances and whatever. So it's like with desire, I kind of bring it back down to this, like, what am I seeking? And sometimes touch is the tool that is sustainable and effective, and sometimes it isn't, but it's the one that's available. And so, or the one that feels available. So I think that sometimes that inner conflict between touch and desire is that area where we get to practice non-judgment, maybe. because like the self-judgment, I think is the thing that keeps us from accessing the touch that we do desire. And if we, you know, you talk about sex ed and it's always about the thing we don't want, as opposed to what do we want. And I see pleasure and desire as being renewable resources versus like shame and avoiding the bad thing as those like, it's like guilt about white supremacy. It's like guilt is not going to be the thing that dismantles white supremacy or patriarchy, right? So it's like it's the what we want is the, like, I don't know, that might have been a tangent, but we'll find out in the recording.
It was it was a mic drop moment. It was profound and mic drop moment. And Layla, you know, I'm sure you agree, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, if it's okay, I'm going to take a different approach on desire, and I'm going to focus on sexual and intimate desire because that's just where I specialize. Yeah, wow, what a big question. Like my palms are sweating. That feels like such a big question to me. But essentially, like intimate touch is a large part of most bonding and connective relationships. Now I emphasize most, not all, but as it was just said, it is available, and it is like for most of us within our makeup, it's connecting and it's bonding. And desire is this like incredibly nuanced, individualized, complex, braided beast of sociological and biological making, and is expected to just be simplified to like, I'm ready. And it's just not that. It's not that. And we don't talk about the complexities of desire. We don't talk as much as I would like to see about the complexities of consent and even like self-consent, and how much the action of, I'm going to like play off of what Samantha was saying here, that action of what am I seeking, and like how that can even perpetuate self-harm. Those that are seeking something that maybe they haven't really sat with. And that's not about, you know, that's neither like good or bad. That just simply is. We're all in our journeys of where we're at. And I think that if you're at that place that you are in this like seeking mentality, there's a reason that you're there. And it's part of the journey of healing. But yeah, I think when it comes to physical touch or touch and the relationship between desire, to simplify like thousands of pages of research I have, what I see is that it's just kind of always comes down to this really simplified version of fear and love. And are you acting out of fear or are you acting out of love? And how do we learn to come into touch with that within ourselves and allow ourselves the permission to, explore both as safely as possible within ourselves and allow space for both to exist, and also like allow the permission for, because we're talking about the reintroduction, I really want to emphasize like allow the permission for love to come back if it's gone, and really allow the space for desire and physical touch or touch to have a marriage and have a healthy relationship, and and know that that is a relationship and that it's not always going to be as like simple and linear as like, I want it, I get it, but more so like this continual compromise with both like the sociological pressures, your own needs and desires, and then like everyone that you're interacting with. So it's just this absolute enigma of a conversation that I am going to have to stop there because we only have a few minutes each.
That was another mic drop moment. And you know what, as we're listening to this, I'm thinking each of these answers that you've given, we could crop each segment and post it as a whole, would say masterclass, but that's the wrong word. Let's figure out another, an expert piece of its own, in its own, because these have been brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. And to your point, Layla, I loved the idea of giving, as a survivor who's experienced sexual violence, how do I give myself permission to come into that space, right? How do I give myself permission, not just for me, but then to enter relationships with other people, given that permission? Mic drop, mic drop. JJ, over to you.
Yeah, well, I'm just awash again. I think Layla just gave such a gorgeous like definition, but also just like affect around what is desire, what is touch. And so I feel like that is, we've got it. You know, the three answers, just we've got it. So I'm hoping I could just share a couple of thoughts that I have about the relationship between desire and touch to sort of maybe bring some of these things together. But I have to start with, as a queer gender nonconforming person, I have a bit of a different relationship to touch than, say, you know, a cis hetero person. The kind of touch that I was interested in growing up, you know, was socially forbidden. And in a lot of places in the US right now, it's becoming legally forbidden. So queer desires are, you know, really policed to the point where they're not supposed to be expressed. We shouldn't touch one another. We shouldn't feel queer sexual joy. And I think this ongoing homophobia and transphobia is really perpetuating rape culture and all the isms that go into it: settler colonialism, racism, ableism, you know, just to name a few. But in my current work, I'm focusing on how queer sexual joy in an embodied sense, like the affect of queer sexual joy, how that actually disrupts our current sexual cultures. And it disrupts it because, one, queerness is already against the status quo, the cis heteronormative status quo, but it's also disrupting neoliberal capitalism, right? Which doesn't want us to be embodied and to be able to feel all of the ick that's going on around us, right? It wants us to stay focused on being individuals and buying things and working ourselves to death. So being embodied, I think, is in and of itself, you know, touch and desire, and allowing us to go to places where our desire can take us to queer spaces. Like, that's revolutionary. The other thing I want to mention is actually about Lori Brotto. So it's so funny that Layla already brought this up. We know from research that the vast majority of cis hetero women focus on the pleasure of their partners rather than their own embodied pleasure. That is horrifying to me. What a revolution it would be if to have this group of folks start noticing what actually feels good to them in their bodies. I think it could have an enormous trickle out effect where other cis heteronormative things in society could be challenged, like the fact that masc and men folk are supposedly natural leaders, whereas femme and women folk aren't, right? So I think of touch as actually breaking hierarchies potentially with other people, because we're just two people connecting moment by moment, as opposed to like being in our heads. Yeah, two people or 10, you never know, right? Exactly. But really just moment to moment being with people, being embodied, I think is the way to, in terms of being a consent researcher and a survivor, I think that's the way to create spaces of safety, right? But touch itself, I just want to say, I think actually can be revolutionary if we really get embodied into ourselves, because that's how we meet other people, is the touching skin, right? And maybe touching hearts and that kind of thing too. But there's a real visceral physicality to it that I think could be really revolutionary.
I see your hands raised, Samantha. Do you want to jump on?
Yeah, I'm just been thinking about it, you know, it's like not like trying to have this conversation, not in the, like, we need to have it in the context of what's happened in the last few years, right? And what's still happening with the pandemic, like with global health crisis in general. And I think that for a lot of people, their relationship to desire and touch really changed, you know, whether you're a survivor or you're not, or, you know, and the ways in which, you know, what co-regulation looks like and how a lot of us were impacted by lacking touch and being an absence of touch. And I think there might even, I'm just kind of like in my own little bubble right now, but I think that there might be a kind of global empathy to survivorship in the way that like that feeling of being fearful of others, just like innately like fearful of touch or fearful of others, is something that I think people experienced on a mass scale for the first time, in a lot of ways. And so it's like, you know, this question of desire and touch is so, for me, almost it's so hard to answer because my relationship to touch and desire really fundamentally changed. And I'm still learning what it looks like from this recent trauma, you know, never mind, you know, what like a survivorship trauma, relearning of touch comes in. So yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to kind of placemate that a little bit because I was like, you know, it's, if you'd asked me that question 4 years ago, I would have had a very different answer.
Mm.
You know?
I love that. And JJ, I love that. Your point, though, really resonated. I'm talking JJ now, the comments you were making about how women, femme, are taught, right? We are raised to overlay our male partner's wishes and desires over our own. And last week, I was talking to my beautiful and brilliant daughter-in-law, Ellen Kaufman. I hope she's listening. And Ellen is just finished her PhD, and her PhD was on, she told me this a million times, it's like engineering intimacy. Hold on, I can tell you what it is. Ellen's PhD that she's defending on Monday is on engineering intimacy, sexual technologies as emerging modes of interpersonal connection. And right, spot on this. And I was asking her about the use of the purpose of the clitoris. And we got into a beautiful Saturday afternoon conversation about what I'd heard years and years ago about the clitoris being the only organ in the human body that has no other purpose apart from, right? And as I read it years ago, and I don't know how biologically, physiologically true that is, but as I read it years ago, it dawned on me that the goddesses must be a woman, because for us to have this organ that serves no other purpose apart from to give us pleasure, and then to have that pleasure and intimacy subjugated at the expense of our male partners, to me was another example of, you know, the patriarchy and its fuckery, right? And so the question that, and we're coming close to where we have to open it up to the audience, but my question is, how do we reclaim pleasure? How do we reclaim touch? What are two things, and pick one, either what are some of the barriers that are stopping us from reclaiming, or what are some of the strategies and opportunities to reclaim, right? So we understand that it's been lost in many of us, many survivors in particular, but it's a part of the socially constructed ways of being that the world, you know, teaches us, regardless of the culture you're coming from. So how do we reclaim it? What are some of the strategies, and what are some of the barriers? And I'm going to start who started? I think it was Sam. Did you start? Yes. So I'm going to start with you. Pick a barrier or a strategy to reclaim.
You're going to start with me again?
Yes, please.
That's good. Okay, yeah, cool. So I love that you brought up the clitoris. It's actually in any mammal. It's not just human, so any mammal. And so I host a sex ed game show that I host in drag. And one of the questions that I ask is about, you know, about the clitoris, like in what year was the full structure of the clitoris discovered? And I give like 1906, 1996, and everyone's like 1936. Everyone always chooses the true answer last because they're blown away by the fact that it's been like 20 seconds since the whole structure of the clitoris has been, you know, discovered by science. And like also naming the fact that not only women have clitorises, many bodies, across the gender spectrum have clitorises, right? And it's like, And then I show them a whole diagram of it, and everyone's like, and I let them know that they're not allowed to show that diagram in public schools. You can see penises, but you can't see that diagram. It's too sexualized, right? And we talk about why don't we know this? And I share a story about going to Montpellier in France. I went to like an anatomy museum, and at the anatomy museum, there's there's a whole room that's devoted to ancient dicks. They're all behind glass. It's like, and I'm like, since the first person who ever had a dick looked at it and was like, let's find out more. And then 5 seconds ago, they're like, oh, hey, this clitoris thing. Wow. Can you imagine? Like no one ever did. And all I don't even know. I don't have a science background. I clearly don't have a PhD. Not a researcher. I'm just a person who's like, okay, why though? And so the barrier to pleasure is not making space for people to ask the why. Like, why? JJ, you said it, you're like, I too grew up in the Cosmo era. And when people ask me why I became a sex educator, I'm like, because I learned 101 ways to please my man every month for found Cosmo in my mom's bathroom. And I'm just like, and I was like, oh, what's an orgasm? She's like, it's a feeling you get when you have sex. I was like, cool, I'm going to try that. And so the barrier is that, we need to invite more curiosity. Where's the curiosity? And neutralizing, like creating more neutral conversation as opposed to good or bad or healthy or unhealthy. It's like neutralizing the behavior. The question is, what is the pathway our brain takes to get there? And is that okay for us? And I think the last thing I'll say that I think is so important as it relates to reclaiming touch, reclaiming pleasure as survivors, is that whether that's us touching ourselves or us touching others, is that some hurts, some harms, some wounds can only be healed through healing experiences. When we talk about community and we talk about individualism and isolation, this idea that I have to heal myself is limited. Like, we're meant to be collective. And so that self-permission, that curiosity, that of course I do, that to me is like the language that I want to see us use more collectively. But we can't do that until we create these spaces to get rid of the shame of not saying shit.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you so much, Samantha. Love that. JJ?
Once again, I'm just sort of like, say more, please. Say more. Yeah. So when I was listening to folks earlier, thinking about intuition and garnering kind of a personal power, I was really thinking about Audre Lorde and her idea of erotic power. And she says that, all women have this. It's an intuition that we have, that we are suppressed, as you were talking about earlier, right? It's suppressed down so that we don't have this power that we can connect to. And so that's what I think I would like to see more of. And it's not just a biologically essentialist thing. It's not just only people in female bodies, whatever that means, can have this power. But I do think it's a women femme power, because of the way we've been socialized and how we exist in this patriarchal world. So even for myself, I notice really trying to get in touch with that intuition, because I know that when I'm in touch with it, things are synchronous around me. Like, things just fall into place. And with people, whether I'm dating or whatever, like, I just think back to old experiences too, where things went not so good. I think I was off of my sync. I was not in touch with my body. I was not listening to really what the message was. And that's not to say we can always get the correct message, right? Our intuition can be skewed. And we can also do self-destructive stuff like we've been talking about. I coped through, for instance, using sex. And that was neither bad nor good. Did I get harmed in the process? Yes. Did it allow me to survive to where I am now? Yes. So it's not about the pathologizing or the shame, again, as folks have been saying, right? Some of this I'm repeating. It's about, I think, yeah, just this inner work. And the erotic power piece I really love, because it also shows the friggin' power of women, right? And women plus folk who, or just folks who are in touch with a kind of softness or tenderness as a human being, and what kind of healing and gentleness that can bring to the world. I think we need that in sexual cultures, right? We need tenderness, we need care. And in terms of things people can actually do through my research, it's something as simple as when you're washing your hands, is the water too hot? How does the temperature feel for you? Would you like to adjust it? Wouldn't you want to wash your hands where the temperature is actually quite right? Wouldn't it be worth taking a split second to adjust the temperature so that you can wash your hands and feel like you're kind of like things are sound, right? Like it feels good, it feels nice. And so I also think reading more of Adrienne Maree Brown and thinking about pleasure activism and just turning to pleasure in our lives, what feels good, is so important. But that also, I want to say, in terms of thinking about the barriers, that is hard. This stuff is hard, especially when we have pathways in our bodies and brains that are telling us, no, bad feels good. It's actually that, we want to sit in these bad feelings because that's what we're used to. And so so I try to think about how can we get folks to just slightly take a step towards something that feels discomforting, but that might be opening them up to healing. And that's a hard thing to get folks to do. And also there's harm that can happen, right? People can be opening to things and then they get re-victimized. So I don't want to end on a really depressing note, but I do want to say that there is no quick fix for this. And I love the idea of glimmers and this idea of starting to look at what feels good and incorporating that more and more into our lives. But as somebody who survived multiple traumas, I can say that, despite having being in a good place in my life, things are still difficult at times, right? Like we're never fully healed. And I love disability justice scholar Leah Lakshmi Peepsna-Samrasina's work on this. Like survivors never have to heal. We can always keep, having triggers and having things come up, but that will also help us heal deeper too. So not to just expect things to go away, but to realize that this is so hard and trauma is so effed up. And we just have to wrestle with it and try to find the good for ourselves and for the folks around us. And I had so many things that I wanted to say, and I hope I kind of cram them all.
You should come back. We will do a part 2. I promise we'll do a part 2, but that is so beautiful. And I'm mindful of the time because I just looked at the chat and there are some beautiful, the Q&A, beautiful points that I really want us to put on the record. But before we do that, I'm going to pass it over to Leila.
Okay, wow. Yeah, I'll try and keep it super quick knowing where we're at. But the thing that really came up for me based on what's already been said here is the depersonalization of dysregulation and really bringing that conversation into the healing of intimacy, the reclamation of touch. And really when you're in those moments where you're coming into awareness, stepping out of avoidance, stepping out of denial, those are big moments. And be in those big moments and don't minimize them. They're really, really big, powerful moments. They're opportunity for healing as much as they are opportunity for awareness, as much as they are radical movements of self-love. And so if I could say just like one thing that I could offer anybody out there that's in the reclamation of touch, whether it be you are with a victim or you are a victim yourself, just when things are getting to be dysregulated, depersonalize it. You are not broken. You do not need to be like fixed. This other person's reaction isn't necessarily about you. It is not about you at all. It is about them. It is their experience. It is their nervous system. And you can absolutely work together to create safety. There are a ton of regulation techniques out there. We don't necessarily have time to get into them, but if you even just look up regulating the nervous system on Google, you'll find tons. And just like depersonalizing this idea that dysregulation has anything to do with like you not being sexy, them not being interested, all these insecurities that can flood in. Like, I feel like if we could just soothe those and allow the dysregulation to be about what it's about, which is the trauma, not the person, not you, not the interaction, but the trauma, then we could really take steps to creating safety for that to become regulated and further steps to be taken.
That was a mic drop. Profound, practical, beautiful, well said, and very succinct. So thank you for that. I'm going to hand over the last comment to Marley.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm also going to try to reel it in. But yeah, I think a major barrier that comes up, and I thought of when you were sharing, JJ, your amazing work on queer sexual joy, I think was the wording. I'm so excited about that work. And I think that a queer approach to these conversations is so helpful for everyone, regardless of sexual orientation and gender, because it asks us to throw out the scripts that we're given. So from the time we're teeny tiny babes, we're given these scripts, which are like blueprints for desire and sexuality and pleasure, and they're very cis, heteronormative, dominant, all these oppressive things. I'm trying to group it all in. Approach that tells us what we should want, when we should want it, who we should want it with, what order we should want it in, all these things. And when we do this work of dismantling all of that and turning back towards our own bodies and our own healing and our authentic desire, we're asked to throw out those scripts, and we might feel like we're kind of improvising for the first time, and it might feel kind of scary. We're like, I don't know what to do anymore. And so that asks us to turn inwards, and what it actually allows us to prioritize is choice, because there's no choice in those scripts. There's just obligation. So when we come into choice, there's so much room for healing, for pleasure, for empowerment and connection. And in terms of strategy, one of my absolute favorite practices from somatic sex education is to just schedule time for yourselves to, it can be called mindful self-pleasure, and that might come with its own script of what that looks like already, but throw out the script and diversify your understanding of pleasure. So all that practice is asking yourself, what would allow me to connect with 1% more pleasure right now? And maybe that's altering your posture. Maybe it's realizing you're hungry, getting a slice of pizza. Maybe it is self-touch. Maybe it's some grounding touch on your arms, your legs. Maybe it's grabbing your favorite vibrator and using that. It could be so many different things, but validating all of it and really coming from that place of embodied choice is so, so important in that reclamation and unlearning those scripts. So that was a hopefully fast enough response.
That was beautiful. That was beautiful. And I really want to honor the participants who dropped in their comments and their questions in the chat. So I'm going to start very quickly with Francesca. Francisca, please forgive me if I'm mispronouncing. Kelsey, do you want to read this actually?
Sure, I can. I hope everyone can hear me as I'm not spotlighted though. Okay, thanks, Sandy. So I'm just going to read it exactly as it's written. Major question from me, Francisca, and why I'm here. How can we manage PTSD responses and automatic ones with touch, disassociation, defense, etc., and manage to be present in the moment? Wanted to add that as I'm also an advocate, I feel like a fraud because I really struggle with touch, advocacy, and living it are very different for me. Thank you for that question also, by the way.
Can you do put into the record all the questions, and if we have time, then maybe the audience, the panelists can jump in. Go on.
I'd love to jump in on this one.
Can we? I'm just saying, can we read all the comments in the chat first of all, and then because if we have time, then we can open it up And if people don't mind staying a few minutes afterwards, which I know they won't, but let's bring in their comments and questions. Thank you.
Sure. So I'll go through each of them. So another anonymous attendee says, my partner is a survivor and they struggle with touch. How can I best support them? Monique writes, my sexual desires as it relates to women have been a part of my life since I was 12, but heightened when I was, and trigger warning for folks, when I was raped by 2 males at 15. Does the fact that my trust in males were broken brought out that curiosity? Natania writes, how do we claim touch and pleasure when triggered in finding safety within our own bodies? For example, how does someone who does not feel safe in their own body experience pleasure and touch when their body is in itself is a trigger? Also, please send my love and kisses to the panelists. So thank you for that, Natania. That's really lovely. And great question as well. And then Nalani, and again, bear with us if we mispronounce your names, working with clients who have experienced childhood sexual abuse, sexual assault, and domestic violence. It has been confusing for many clients to experience pleasure during physical intimacy because it can be confusing, it can be triggering, and it can feel wrong to feel good. Any suggestions for how to reclaim pleasure and engage in physical intimacy?
So I hope you remember all of those. So Layla, I'm going to go straight to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on the PTSD one, just because I actually have some notes on that. So my major suggestion would be getting in with the counselor, if there's lots of low cost or free counseling as well. PTSD is very complex, and it speaks exactly to what I was speaking to before, which is just like it's stored in the nervous system. And essentially what research is showing today is that PTSD is basically just like a nervous system response to stored trauma. And so if you are having like a large visceral response to touch, as you had communicated, a lot of what that comes down to is regulating. So coming back through means like breath, through means like awareness. Everyone can find their own nuanced way to bring yourself back to baseline, but it's essentially gently bringing yourself, being aware of when you are in fight or flight, because especially if you have complex trauma, complex PTSD, you can be in that state so frequently that you may not even be aware how frequently you're in that state. You might just be operating from that state. And so recognizing the signs, ooh, I'm not okay, and finding the methods that work for you to bring you back to baseline. And it is a long and at times arduous process, but it's healing in this particular way is entirely possible. And a lot of it has to do with just awareness around dysregulation. And so if you and your partner, I believe there was a partner involved in that particular question, can really come into tune with what regulation looks like and what dysregulation looks like, you guys can find peaceful and safe ways to cultivate regulation and co-regulate in that moment. And that's entirely possible, but I would recommend the support of a professional during the process, because you just don't want to shoot yourself out of dysregulation too quickly and not know what to do, how to bring yourself back safely. The other thing I wanted to say was just, yeah, I'm so proud of you for asking that question, and thank you for putting yourself out there like that. And I believe in your guys' capacity to heal.
Love that. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Layla, for that really spot on practical steps. Samantha has a hand up.
Hi, yeah, if I can add to that. So I'm someone who lives with PTSD and complex PTSD, and what I find is really helpful is to acknowledge that we may always have PTSD. We may always have and we kind of talked about that earlier. And the way that I've come to kind of understand it is when I'm having symptomatic PTSD. It's like, okay, that like it's a symptom, right? Like I'm experiencing symptoms. And you know, I love grounding techniques. I also love like arousal techniques, because sometimes it's like I'm dissociated, so now I need to dance to choreograph whatever that I've done in my own living room. But aside from that, I find the hardest part about being someone who lives with PTSD is when I don't have a sense of myself outside of it, right? When it's like, okay, this is like a symptomatic thing. There's things that activate it, there's things that heighten it. But I still have a sense of myself. When I lose that sense of myself and I just feel like I'm just like a ball of the PTSD. Someone said the thing of like, how do I experience pleasure and touch when my body itself is what's activating me? You know what I mean? It's like, I think that the things that we do, whether we're activated or not activated, the ways that we create a sense of ourself um, is also like a really practical and like emotional tool. So asking yourselves like, what is it that makes me feel like I have a sense of myself? And that might be connecting with friends. That might be like I'm a big like Major League Baseball fan and softball player. Like, you know, like there's this like these parts of us, sewing, craft, whatever it is that makes you feel like you have a you and that you're someone who has these symptoms. It's like, I don't know, for me, that's created breathing room when I can't heal, when I'm tired of being in recovery, when I, you know, it's like, okay, I'm having symptomatic PTSD right now, but I'm still someone who really loves my friend, you know? So I just wanted to add to that.
Yeah. I'm going to go to Marley because it's now 2:30 and we always want to respect people's time and end on time as much as possible. So if Marley, and then give JJ like a few seconds again to wrap up before we say thank you. I promise you all that we will do this again. We'll have a second webinar conversation because this is obviously not enough. So over to you, Marley, and then JJ.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to partially answer two of these mainly through a resource. So there's a really amazing book called The Sexual Healing Journey by Wendy Maltz. And there are just so many incredible resources in there. I see a question from an anonymous person on their partner being a survivor, struggling with touch, how can they support them, which is so beautiful, by the way. I mean, just by being here, I think is such an absolutely beautiful gesture that I know to me as a survivor would mean so much. But there are some really tangible practices in there for relearning touch. Yeah, thanks, Samantha. Yeah, I reference it all the time. With a partner and solo, which I think both are so needed, the personal and the relational healing. And then Monique, there's this question around sexual desire. My sexual desire as it relates to women has been part of my life, you said. It was heightened after sexual assault. And does the fact that my trust in males being broken, did that bring out that curiosity? So that was the question. And again, thank you so much for that vulnerability. And I can just relate to that so much. That was a really big question I had after sexual trauma when I was questioning sexuality. And because of it, it doesn't sound like you're doing this, but I really sort of gaslighted myself. And I was like, maybe I'm not actually queer. Maybe I'm just traumatized, like this kind of thing. And so much of that came from internalized homophobia. And there's actually no consensus around what causes homosexuality or heterosexuality. There's no shared consensus and decision around that. So we don't know what causes that. We know that sexual trauma can have an influence. But I also want to say, like, it's okay for sexuality and desire to change. It's okay for that to change after trauma, and it changes for everyone in different ways throughout life. So just validating that and honoring and celebrating who you are and how you express sexuality, and just pointing out that the only reason that any of us might be like, oh no, I'm queer, not that that's what you said, but that's definitely what I experienced, is internalized homophobia and transphobia. So again, JJ, so grateful for your work in this world, for speaking to so many of those things. And yeah, thank you, Monique, so much for that question. And thank you everyone for having these like really courageous conversations.
Thank you, Marley. Thank you for all of that. JJ?
Yeah, I just wanted to speak to two things pretty quickly. One was I try to focus on folks who are most challenged by issues around things like dissociation. In my work, I found dissociation was the #1 thing that got in the way of consent processes or that caused sexual harm in terms of like the impacts of trauma, the psychosocial impacts. And so if I'm thinking about, I mean, Samantha, what you shared around like connection within oneself and finding a sense of self. I mean, trauma is what like evacuates the self. That's what dissociation is. It's like, bye-bye, pulled the parachute, I'm out of here, can't face this reality, right? And so I think about folks, and I've been in this place many years ago, thankfully, but where I just did not really have a grasp of my sense of self with which to navigate sex, but I was having a lot of sex. And so as a coping mechanism. And so I think about those survivors and what do we tell them? And at the time, you know, if there was mindfulness in my high school, I wouldn't have been good at it. That would have been torture for me. I didn't want to be present. I couldn't be present. And that's okay because I was traumatized, right? So I'm just thinking about those folks that we can't give answers to in a way. And I just want to hold space for that, that there are ways that things will just hurt. And there's going to be mistakes and roads taken that lead to painful encounters, but just being, you know, returning back to that non-judgmentalness. And I think the biggest takeaway and the biggest thing that's helped me is just learning how to be tender with myself. So I wanted to say that, and also just echo what Marley was saying around, you know, we don't know where sexual desire necessarily stems from. I just think it's very socially constructed, and I skew away from biological explanations, generally speaking. But one of my favorite articles I ever read was, I think it was called "Cis Heteronormativity Made Me a Lesbian." And, you know, I really relate to that in a way. You know, I don't, it's okay to not find heterosexuality appealing in this world, right? But I think in my own experience too, being open to queer experiences was very scary, right? It often is for folks. But then we learn that there's all sorts of other ways to do things, and that there's like a lot of people could be having a lot of different experiences if they were open to it. So yeah, I just want to say that I guess that sexuality is messy and trauma is messy, you know, touch, desire, these things coming together, it's messy. And I'm just so grateful for this community today and other people who are doing this work so that we can have just less harm despite the mess. So thank you.
We have run out of time, Samantha. I'm so sorry. I am so sorry. This has been, I could be here for an hour and a half, double the time, and we still wouldn't have gone as far as I want to. But again, trying to respect and honor the people who showed up for like the hour and a half. We've gone over by like 10 minutes. I want to say, just give my profound gratitude to each of you, Samantha Bitty, Marley Liss, Dr. JJ Wright, and Layla Lelove, who had to bounce because she had another meeting. I'm just so profoundly grateful to have had the opportunity to be in community with you, talking about this critical issue that impacts the whole world, I want to thank everybody that joined us as a participant in the audience. I want to thank everybody that put in their chats, and again, the point around vulnerability. I really, really appreciate all of you. I am sending you my love. I am wishing you light for the rest of your day until we meet again and hang out together and in this beautiful space with these beautiful conversations. Thank you all so very much for your time and your participation. Bye, everyone. Good. Don't oh, okay. She's gone. I should have said that.